So hello everybody, good afternoon and welcome to the first of our lunchtime seminars here at Research Week at Carlow College, St. Patrick's. Our speaker today is Dr. James Heaney, and James is going to speak on Republicanism and Revolution in the Literature of Ireland and Spain from 1919 to 1939. James came to the college in 2003 as a lecturer in English literature and Irish studies and was head of the humanities department from 2005 to 2010. And in that time, he introduced creative writing, drama and performance, and Spanish onto the curriculum at Carlow College. He's published in a wide range of journals on topics related to modern Irish and Spanish literature. And he's currently working on a study of the literatures of the Irish and Spanish revolutions with particular reference to republicanism, which is the subject of today's talk. So I'm going to hand over now to James to deliver his talk. Thanks, James.
Okay, thanks very much, Owen, and everyone for coming. And I understand there's a few people online as well. You're very welcome too. So probably heard the one about the tourist who lost her way in Ireland on a walking tour of Ireland, and she found herself in a forest, maybe a Ballinabranna forest up the road here, and she couldn't get out of it. And it was getting dark, and she was walking around in circles along these dim pathways, wondering would she ever get back. She was on her way to, let's say, Carlow, the metropolis of Carlow, where she had a room booked for the night. But she was losing all hope by the time of the evening sun coming in. And eventually, just as she was starting to really panic, she spots what looks like a local man in the distance. Might have been our own Larry. There was a tree hugger at the weekends, I understand. And so she runs up to Larry and she says, "How do I get out of here? Will you please tell me how I get to Carlow town?" And Larry pauses and he looks around and he hems and haws and rubs his chin a little bit as he does. And he says to her, "Carlow, is it? Well, if I was you, I wouldn't start from here anyway." So what has that got to do with revolution, we might ask? Well, I think it kind of reveals quite a bit. It's not the worst joke, as Paddy Irishman or Larry Irishman jokes go. You know, of course, there's an element of the thick Paddy about it. Where else could the woman start her journey but from where she was? But at the same time, I think we understand there's a kind of intelligence at work in the local man's advice at the same time. He knows that she's not going to be able to walk in a straight line to where she wants to go, given the terrain and the night and all the rest of it. She's going to have to move a little bit circuitously, maybe doubling back on herself a little bit, going down some kind of narrow old boreens and all the rest of it. And the really funny thing is that this won't bring her to where she wants to go, this route, this circuitous route, but only to a point where she'll be able to see the cathedral spires of Carlow in the distance and then start moving towards it. So this relates, I think, to the idea or the concept of revolution in the following manner. Revolutions are events that attempt to change the world or some part of it in fundamental ways, to change it utterly, as William Butler Yeats says in his iconic poem, Easter 1916, all's changed utterly, a terrible beauty is born. So the idea being that it isn't kind of a piecemeal type of a change that's involved in revolution, but something wholesale and fundamental. So revolutionaries want to change the world, or at least some part of it. And this is what distinguishes them from terrorists, really. Terrorists just want to, well, terrorize it, or some part of it. Of course, in reality, we all know that revolutionaries often resort to terrorism in pursuit of their greater good type objectives when they've come to the view that, well, unfortunately, needs must. And many people would argue anyhow that the term terrorist is little more than a label that counter-revolutionaries use to denigrate their opponents one man's terrorist being another man's freedom fighter and all of that. However, the point still holds, I think, that what distinguishes the concept of the revolutionary from the terrorist is that revolutionaries want to, as I say, change the world, not just blow it up. Revolutionaries, we might say, have the vision thing. However, possessing a vision of a new world, or being possessed by a vision of a new world, as some revolutionaries certainly are, a more just or beautiful or orderly world, doesn't imply that one knows how to make that vision a reality. Indeed, it's one of the most common and tragic failings of revolutionary movements throughout history that they've proved incapable of traversing that kind of shape-shifting terrain between where they are and where they want to be. A map of the world, yes, that's coming up, yeah. A map of the world, Oscar Wilde wrote in the quotation there, visible on your PowerPoint, hopefully, that doesn't include utopia is not even worth glancing at. But of course, the reason why utopia doesn't appear in any map is that nobody knows how to get there exactly. And the problem here, really, to haul Jean-Paul Sartre into the argument is other people. You, from my perspective, and me, from your perspective. Other people, hell is other people, Sartre maintained. They're always screwing up those perfect plans we dream up at 2 o'clock in the morning on the way home from the Irishman's or wherever it might be. If it wasn't for other people interfering in my plans, I'd have solved the housing crisis in Ireland in a jiffy. But here's the problem for me and for Sartre, who often accompanies me home at 2 o'clock in the morning, I have to say. A utopia, a vision of a society, a perfect society, is a vision of a perfect society. And human society is, of course, composed of other people. So it'd be rejecting other people, a bit like devising a plan to build 50,000 new houses to solve the housing crisis and then refusing to let anybody into them because they'd only wreck the gaff. So I'm pushing it to extremes a little bit here, of course, but the problem of other people, I think, is a very real one for utopian-minded thinkers, for revolutionaries, that is, who want to create a world in which people can live together in peace, love, and harmony. It's, I think, the most important and intractable problem in many ways, because we can all dream up worlds we think are perfect, but what happens when our notion of a perfect society conflicts with other people's ideas? Imagine, for example, that your idea of a perfect world, a perfect Ireland or Spain or US, actually exists right now. Your dream has come true. Everything is just the way you want it to be, the way you think it should be, socially, economically, culturally, politically. It's just perfect. But now imagine that the person beside you is doing the same thing, imagining her utopia. And it's highly unlikely, of course, that your two utopias are going to agree in every important respect. Maybe she wants to abolish taxes or private property or ban religion or the arts, indeed, as Plato effectively did in his Republic, banishing the poets from his polis, his perfect world, because they're only going to stir up false ideas in people's imaginations. So you've got a problem. Your utopia is better, of course, than the person sitting beside you. Yours is, if you like, more perfect than hers. But there she is, all the same, breathing the same air as you, making plans for everyone just like you. So what are you going to do about her? You could try ignoring her and hope that she'll go away. But what if she doesn't? What if she stays and starts putting it about that this so-called perfect world of yours is actually a deeply unjust and unworkable disaster? What if she starts disobeying your laws, presuming you've made any, and encouraging others to do likewise? Well, you could follow Thomas More's example in the original Utopia of 1516, Renaissance text, and outlaw any discussion of political issues outside of the official political assemblies. But is that really the best of all possible worlds, we might ask, if it only survives by punishing people who want to speak their minds? Other options include anarchists, as I mentioned already, kind of where there's an absence of laws and this very optimistic belief that human nature, once it's given its opportunity, people will live in peace and harmony with each other and don't need any authoritarian organization telling them what to do and what not to do. But what if your opponent, your political opponent, disagrees with that? And she does want a little bit of law and order in her life, for example. What do you do then? A liberal response would respond by saying, well, you know, she can do whatever she wants. She's entitled to do, live her own utopia, if you like, so long as she doesn't interfere with anybody else's ideas of their perfect world. So we're all walking around in a liberal universe with our own little personal utopias then. And so long as we don't encroach on the territory of anybody else, then we're all right. But that's kind of the John Stuart Mill's, the great liberal 19th century thinker's harm principle. Do whatever you like personally, individually, so long as you don't encroach on the rights and interests and health of anybody else. But the problem with this from a utopian perspective is that, well, it's very personalized. And utopia is supposed to be about community. And then again, the only way in which kind of the state or kind of politics becomes relevant in this world is when there's a problem. So it's a pretty kind of a negative view of a perfect world, very individualized, privatized. And in any case, it's not so much a utopia, but similar to the world in which we live. The no harm principle, do what you like so long as you don't hurt anybody else, is kind of one of the few political principles that most people in the West would still agree with today, I think. So the issue here, as several commentators have noted, theorists of utopia, is that utopia is often imagined in terms that are apolitical, that seek to do away with politics. And instead, we need complete agreement in order to have peace and harmony. Now, as Ernest Bloch remarks, that the utopian narratives, what they share in common with fairy tales is that they're all on the march towards a happy ending where we all kind of agree with each other and as I say, live in peace and harmony. But is it possible to imagine a human society that's devoid of conflict? Is it even desirable? Not conflict in the sense of war and bloodshed, but conflict in the sense of disagreement, argumentation. Disagreement, Ben Dupree remarks, is the essence of politics. The polis may be the product of civil collaboration, Dupree remarks, but its animating force is conflict. So while we all might be attracted to a world in which, well, there's no politics anymore, don't have to worry about that, according to one influential understanding of the world, politics doesn't refer to kind of parliaments and political organizations and parties so much as a way of being in the world. And this idea really originates with Aristotle in the 5th and 4th century BC, when he's writing his Politics and giving the first kind of detailed articulation as to what a perfect world, a perfect polis, or city-state is about. Aristotle suggests that we are, by nature, political animals, largely on account of the fact that we are language-speaking animals. This is what differentiates us from the animal kingdom, that we think about things in terms of right and wrong, in terms of good and bad, evil and right type of thing. Not that we can know the answers to those questions necessarily, but that's the way we engage with reality and other people. To put it in the terms of Herbert McCabe, a modern Aristotelian philosopher, he suggests that we are ineluctably political. So we lose our kind of political stroke ethical sensibility, the same thing for Republicans really, then we lose what it means to be human itself. But then we have a problem. If we are innately politically minded, given to disagreement, discussion, contestation about the way in which we live and the nature of relationships and civic society, then is a utopia possible at all? Well, funnily enough, it was a contemporary of Thomas More, the author of the original Utopia, Niccolo Machiavelli, who came up with an approach to that issue that really overcomes that problem of having a kind of a perfect society that is at the same time contentious, energetic, built around disagreement and the like. So for Machiavelli, in his discourses, rather than in the more famous book, The Prince, he turns back to the models of ancient Greece, the polis, the city-state of ancient Greece, and more particularly the Republic of Rome. And he says, well, why were those republics successful? They were successful because they were built upon the idea of diversity of opinion and a kind of a multiplicity of perspectives. And he says, you know, there's a number of ways of orchestrating a society. You can have rule of one, a kind of a monarchy or a dictatorship, rule of the few, an elite, an aristocracy, or rule of the many, the masses, majoritarian rule and the like. And he says each of those has their advantages, but they're fundamentally flawed because they tend to lead to tyranny, right? So he says the solution to that is there's a fourth option. And this is the model that was constructed really in ancient Rome, the idea of a mixed constitution, a balance of powers, as the US Constitution formulated it. So nobody is in complete charge, and society moves along kind of in a positive direction because everybody has something at stake in the decision-making process, but nobody controls this decision-making process. So at one at the same time, Machiavelli argues that what everybody wants in their society, in their perfect republic, is order and security, right? You know, we don't want to be constantly under threat from enemies or neighbors or the state. We want that sense of security. But he says the only way in which a perfect republic can come into existence and survive is through a degree of antagonism, a degree of disagreement and political living. And he says that freedom for people to kind of enter into the public realm and disagree with each other and argue for their case is the essence of the success of the ancient Roman republics and of any republic in his own time in Italy. So if we quote here from, no one can in any mode, like the historians in the audience will know that this was a very tumultuous world, of course, in the Roman republics. But what Machiavelli does, he kind of turns our kind of a instinctive reaction to that on its head, and he says, no, that's the secret of their success, the tumultuous quality or nature of their political life. So in this quotation, he writes, no one can in any mode with reason call a republic disordered, where there are so many examples of virtue. He's referring to the ancient Roman republics. For good examples arise from good education from good laws, and good laws from those tumults that many inconsiderately damn. For whoever examines their end well will find that they, the tumults in ancient Rome, the republic, as a republic, have engendered not any exile or violence unfavorable to the common good, a key idea in Republican ideology. It's not your good, it's not my good, it's the common good that, that the republic aspires to. So these tumults don't kind of engender any exile or violence unfavorable to the common good, but laws and orders in benefit of public freedom. So public freedom, you can't have it without that sense of political life, energetic, vibrant, often, contentious, political discussion. Previously, and even today, indeed, we try to kind of oppose those poles, you know, security, peaceful living versus argumentation and conflict in a political discourse. But Machiavelli, his trick was, no, they go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. So freedom to express your views, to argue and persuade is essential to the life of a republic. Now, in our own day, Machiavelli's ideas have been articulated, I think, most effectively by Hannah Arendt, a mid-20th century philosopher and a very strong advocate of republicanism. Republicanism in the sense of Machiavelli, there's lots of different versions of republicanism, but Machiavelli's sense of it in particular, and the ancient Athenian models that Aristotle is writing about in his Politics. And Aristotle forwards kind of similar ideas, you know, about, particularly we'll see the importance of freedom. So Hannah Arendt writes, while all aspects of the human condition are somehow related to politics, this plurality is specifically the condition of all political life. So the diversity, you know, we tend to think of, well, the state, it's like a kind of a rugby team at the weekend. You have to be one, you have to all be united and on the same hymn sheet, or else the thing's going to fall apart. But what Arendt, following Machiavelli, is saying, no, that's got it wrong. The diversity, the plurality of all the different elements that make up a republic are what constitute its success. So a little further on here, she says action, and she thinks this is what politics is primarily about, action, including speech as a form of action. She says, would be unnecessary, an unnecessary luxury, a capricious interference with general laws of behavior if men were endlessly reproducible repetitions of the same model, whose nature or essence was the same for all and as predictable as the nature or essence of any other thing. Plurality is the condition of human action because we are all the same, that is human, in a way that nobody is ever the same as anyone else who has ever lived, lives, or will live. So it's our difference, our otherness from each other, if you like, that ensures or underpins the success of a perfect republic. We are what both of these thinkers, Machiavelli and Arendt, are suggesting is we are political animals. That's, you know, part of our nature, and that's the idea, as I said, that originates really with Aristotle. So when Aristotle is writing about, and Machiavelli latterly, the idea of a perfect polis, this idea of freedom is absolutely paramount, right? Now, it's not freedom in the way we often understand it, which is in a sort of a liberal sense of escaping from oppression, or the ability to do whatever I feel like doing. I want to be free and nobody's allowed to stop me type of thing. Aristotle says somebody who thinks freedom consists in being allowed to do whatever they want to do is literally an idiot, right? They don't get it, right? What freedom involves in a Republican perspective is quite different. It's not freedom from constraint, right, which is the liberal notion of it, as Isaiah Berlin kind of articulated it. Rather, it's freedom to involve yourself. It's freedom to participate in the life of your community, to live a political life, to join, to be welcomed into that public zone, and your opinions valued, although you won't always get your own way or whatever, but your voice is heard. So that's, when we talk about freedom, it's absolutely essential to Republican ideology or philosophy, if you prefer, but it's a particular notion of freedom that is being advocated, as I say, not this freedom from, but freedom to. And that traditionally leads to quite a lot of criticism of Republican ideology by liberal critics, maybe in particular, who say, well, you know, what that means really is that Republicanism is a form of closed communitarianism, and everybody has to more or less agree with each other and have the same sort of culture and core beliefs in order for that to function. But as we've seen, for people like Machiavelli and Hannah Arendt, that's a complete misunderstanding of it. They welcome the diversity of attitudes and opinion and disagreement and the like. So is that making sense? First of all, yeah, okay. There's a couple of key ideas that I want to I'm just going to refer to them briefly here because we'll come back to them as we move through. So I'm just going to close that down maybe. There we go. Yes, this quote is from Plato's Republic. So Plato being Aristotle's teacher, so in ancient Greek again. I love this idea. Thinking is the intermediate state. I'll have to lower that again. Between believing and knowing. Thinking is the intermediate state between believing and knowing. So when we're talking about humans as I hope I don't, as political animals, right? Language speaking animals who, because of their linguistic capacity, are able to engage with ideas of right and wrong, good and evil and the like. It's not that, as I said earlier, we have the answers to any of those ethical, political questions, but that they're the terms in which we encounter reality. So to be a Republican is to be a thinker, in effect, right? Not a great philosopher or thinker type of thing, but somebody who, as Hannah Arendt says, she encourages people in 20th century to think about what you're doing, you know, to be conscious of it. As we'll see in a few minutes, to be what the Spanish poet Antonio Machado refers to the conciencia vigilante, a vigilant conscience. So you're awake to the world in which you live. You know, you're not kind of trotting through it in a habitual or routine fashion, accepting these realities that you live in as permanent. You're engaging with it continuously. So that's what the thinking signifies. That's the fundamental characteristic of a Republican, somebody who's engaging mentally with their with the issues that kind of arise in their everyday existence, not solving all the problems, but interested in them. And what Arendt suggests is that that's a kind of a feature, a condition of the polis itself, the city-state or the nation-state, as it's a republic, you know, communities, people coming together to discuss different ideas about how things should be organized. But it's also a quite kind of natural human capacity, because she says, this is Arendt in The Human Condition, she says, this is how we function in the world anyway. This is what it means to be human. When we think, we're engaging with a dialogue with ourselves, you know, the two in one, who we are, comes to the fore, right? We'd like to think of ourselves as kind of singular entities. But anytime when I'm shaving in front of the mirror in the morning, as I sometimes do, I'm having a right old conversation with myself. Hope nobody's listening too often. And when we think, that's what thinking is. It's a dialogue. So the individual psyche kind of replicates the reality, the political reality of a polis in that respect. It's all discursive, argumentative at times, when I hear some of my conversations in the morning, but productive, right? And so this form of republicanism then is really what philosophers refer to involves a sort of an argument from nature rather than an ideology. They're trying to draw out what's implicit in what it means to be human at a psychic kind of a level, and also in the world as we sometimes find it, and build upon that inductively to kind of construct, well, this is, given what we are as human beings, dialogic, given what a human community should be, then we need to move along that kind of avenue if we want to create a sort of a utopia. So thinking is absolutely essential. And this is where writing becomes significant in the revolutions I'm going to talk about now, because writing is, of course, a form of thinking. There's a beautiful quotation I love by Maria Zambrano, a writer living in Spain in the 1930s during the time of the revolution, and one of the most profound thinkers about the relationship between politics and literature and the role of literature within that. And she writes that to write is to uphold the solitude in which one finds oneself, an action that only emerges from a genuine isolation, but from a communicable isolation, which precisely because of the distance from every concrete thing makes possible a discovery of the relations between them. So what writing does as a form of thought, it doesn't provide us with this kind of enlightenment notion of, you know, we can be totally objective from some sort of Archimedean point outside of the realities in which we live, but it gives us some sort of a distance from the world, from the things that make up our worlds, and thereby enables a degree of objectivity, or at least we can see things and the relationships between them for what they are. And that isolation, the other key point she's making there, I think, is communicable because it's language. And as the Republicans from Aristotle up to Herbert McCabe emphasize, language, that thing that we think is, you know, in thought, most private, most personal, is a creation of the community in which we live. It's one of the surest proofs that we are, as Aristotle says, social animals or political animals. You know, we have our subjectivity, but even our subjectivity expresses itself in thought, and the thought is a language that isn't ours. We don't make it up ourselves. It belongs to the community which nurtures us. So the connection between the individual and the communal language is absolutely intrinsic to that. So what this has to do with and briefly again. So we're going to look at, hopefully, in the time that we have, a couple of key ideas in republicanism. First of all, I've mentioned one of them already, the idea of freedom, the Republican conception of that, the idea of equality, and thirdly, the idea of fraternity. Three key ideas in Republican ideology, expressed in the French revolutionary motto, of course, liberté, égalité, fraternité, but really find their origins back in ancient Greece. And so the idea of freedom, we can say, is particularly important to the literary movements that emerged in Spain and in Ireland during the revolutions and in the periods leading up to the revolutions themselves. We're talking about, in terms of these revolutionary years, Ireland 1913 to 23 and Spain 1930 to 39. Now, I know the audience are pretty familiar with the Irish circumstances, given all the media around the decade of commemorations and what have you. But, you know, 1913, the passing of the Home Rule Bill for Ireland through the British Parliament for the third time. So that was promising a significant degree of independence. And then we have the 3 private armies formed in that year, the Ulster Volunteer Force, the Irish Volunteers, the Irish Citizen Army, and then into the outbreak of World War I, of course, 1914 to 1918, the Easter Rising of 1916, then the War of Independence, the establishment of the Irish Parliament in Dublin, and lastly, the so-called Irish Civil War of 1922-23. I say so-called because really the whole revolutionary era is a kind of a civil war in many respects. Irish man and Irish woman against each other, you know, not necessarily in arms, but in terms of ideas, in terms of this sense of political conflict. In Spain in 1930, we have the real strong emergence of the Republican movement under the leadership of people like Manuel Azaña and the Pact of San Sebastian, 1929-1930. And then the Second Republic replaces peacefully through municipal elections the dictatorship of Primo de Rivera and the monarchy of Alfonso as well. He exiles himself from the country. And we have 4 or 5 years of Republican rule, very kind of difficult period of Republican rule because there's lots of opposition within Spain to the Republican government. But nevertheless, between 1931 to 1936, Spain is officially a republic. And it draws up a new constitution and referring to itself as a republic of workers of all classes. And it brings together a very wide spectrum of political opinion, socialists, radical socialists, kind of center-left socialists, Republicans, liberals, conservatives, and it functions sometimes reasonably well, sometimes not so well, because at times the contestation becomes a little bit too borders on violence. And indeed, the pro-Republican parties are ousted from power in 1933 elections, and they regain power under the kind of the banner of the Popular Front, another kind of coalition of pro-Republican parties in 1936. But anti-Republican forces within Spain, the army, major industrialists and the like, and of course the Catholic Church, the hierarchy, very anti-Republican. And so this issues in a coup d'etat in July 17th of 1936. General Francisco Franco takes charge of the nationalist forces, as they call themselves, and a 3-year civil war ensues in which maybe 500,000 people, maybe a lot more, lose their lives. So there's a range of differences between the two revolutions, of course, in Ireland and Spain, not least of all the size of the two countries and the extent of the military campaigns and violence and death that is suffered between them. But they're alike, and they can be compared, I think, in two related respects. One, the importance of Republican ideology to both revolutionary movements. You know, 1916, we have a Republican proclamation. The IRB, who organized 1916, are a Republican Brotherhood. The Dáil Éireann vote, the parliament that comes into existence in 1919, represents itself as a Republican parliament, as a Republican vote. The reason for the Civil War of 1922-23 is because Republican values of freedom, in particular, haven't been achieved. There's no question about that, but some people view that as unacceptable. The fight must go on, and other people, Collins, echoing Pearse, represents it as a stepping stone to freedom, and we have to be more pragmatic and realistic. But Republicanism is essential to the ideology of the Irish Revolution. And I think it's a form of republicanism, when we look at it from the literature of the period, that echoes the ideas that Machiavelli and Hannah Arendt are forwarding in their writings. Similarly, in Spain, it's very, even more obviously, a Republican coalition of forces that establish the Second Republic in 1931, and then during the Civil War of 36 to 39, it's Republicans versus these self-styled nationalists. Of course, nationalists also being aided by forces extraneous to the country, particularly German Nazis and the Italian fascists. The Civil War would have been over within a couple of months if it wasn't for the aid of that Hitler in particular provided to Franco's forces. So literature is significant in this sense, because if we come back to that idea of Plato, thinking, kind of the midway between believing and knowing, is a really characteristic feature of some of the more engaged Republicans from the period. Not to say every Republican, it's a very complex political theory, and different people have different ideas of what it involves, But when we look at some of the key figures from the literary movement, somebody like Antonio Machado in a Spanish context, very much inspired by these kind of Athenian ideas of republicanism. In relation to the idea of freedom, for example, the literature that emerged from Machado and the movement, the literary movement that he was involved with, that came to the fore after the 1898 loss of the Spanish colonies, was very much about participation and getting kind of people to kind of invest their energies again in the notion of a communal identity. So he kind of, as a Republican, saw his writing as opposed to the individualism that liberal ideology had brought to the fore in Spain in the modern era, just as a lot of the revivalist writers in an Irish context were very much opposed to the secularism and the materialism and the utilitarianism that they believed animated British imperialism and European life more generally. So we find that in a lot of writings by people like W.B. Yeats and by people like Machado. And the interesting thing about that and the manner in which it it doesn't just advocate republicanism, but actually kind of instantiates it, is that we find in Yeats's poems, for example, picking an example here, something like The Fisherman, his famous poem from 1914, which is a poem that celebrates the memory of his great friend, John Middleton Synge, who he felt had been really in effect killed by nationalists who opposed his freedom of expression when he was writing plays like The Playboy, The Western World in 1907, that didn't necessarily present the kind of image of Ireland that nationalists wanted to promote. And Yeats is scathing there of his fellow nationalists and how this was a kind of a form of political thuggery that did down John Middleton Synge, and he loses faith in the revolution at that point on account of it. But the significant aspect of that, from our perspective, is that what Yeats is really doing, he's writing for his Irish audience, and he is kind of an exemplary Republican citizen in that sense, in the sense that he's able and willing and determined to put his view across to his audience, even though it's not popular. And he cites people like Aristophanes, that Noel was referring to yesterday in his talk, as an example of how writers have a responsibility to critique the community in which they belong if they're going to be a full citizen. Machado does a very similar thing in relation to the murder of Garcia Lorca, Federico Garcia Lorca, in 1936. He writes a poem about that crime where he slates not the Nazis or even the Spanish fascists, but his own community, Lorca's own community in Granada, who looked away when Lorca was being taken out to be murdered. And he says, that was an awful crime. He refers to it as such in his writings. It was a terrible crime. It's not a crime committed by an outsider, by a foreigner. It's a crime committed by our own community against one of our own. So this is, as I say, the idea of the freedom of the individual. That's what your freedom as a Republican consists in. Not doing whatever you like, not escaping from oppression, although of course that's necessary, but voicing your opinion to the community, engaging in that kind of contestation. Just briefly, if we've time, Owen, look at this idea of equality. I think it's one of the most fascinating topics to look at from a Republican perspective and in relation to events in both Ireland and Spain. Equality, it's an issue that affects everybody, of course, but as we know now more than ever, particularly in relation to gender politics. And the revolutions in both countries were notable in respect to the opportunities that they afforded women in particular to enter into the public zone. In Spain, there was a huge kind of flowering of different organizations, social, cultural, overtly feminist, to, for example, most importantly, win the right for women at this time. Women didn't have the vote or couldn't sit in Parliament up until this time. Similarly, in Ireland, we have the emergence of the Franchise League, of Ban na HÉireann, Maná na HÉireann, for example. Women, again, coming into the public zone, often in overt kind of military capacity, as in 1916, but more importantly, if anything, in terms of just being enabled to voice their opinions and views, very often through the press, as historians like Karl Coulter, journalists, and historians like Ruth Talion and Karen Steele in her study of the media and the press and the opportunities it afforded women at the time. But what's interesting from, again, the Republican perspective in relation to the idea of equality and freedoms and how they pertain to women at the period is in terms of the disagreements that emerged between women in many respects in this period. If we look just briefly at some of the really important figures from the period, some of the leaders of women's movement from this era. Constance Markievicz there on our left, who in 1909, in a lecture to female members of the burgeoning literary society, encourages them, you can read this as I'm talking here, to not to join the suffrage movement unless the suffrage movement puts the national cause at the forefront of its endeavors. From Markievicz's view, there'll be no freedom for women unless Ireland wins independence and establishes itself as a republic. But on the opposite end of the spectrum, and Markievicz was a feminist, as we all know, but it's a matter of practicalities in her view. There's no point in fighting a feminist cause until you achieve the independence of the community in which you live. But Hanna Sheehy Skeffington, at this point in history, 1909, replies to Markievicz and says, you've got it completely wrong. What we have to do as women is forward our own roles and position in society, look after ourselves first, and then we'll engage with the nationalist movement and the Sinn Féin movement. So one of them, it's cart or horse. They're both nationalist, they're both Republican, they're both feminist, but the argument concerns is, where's the priority? Where's the kind of the strategic value? Should we push feminism first and then the Republican cause will follow after it? Or do we need an independent republic first and then we'll kind of nurture our feminist ideals? A similar sort of disagreement emerges in Spain in 1931 when people like Clara Campoamor and Victoria Kent, there on your left and your right, both elected to the Cortes, the Spanish Parliament, in 1931. 3 women elected for the first time ever. And in the Constitution, there's a big discussion around whether women should be granted the vote. And this is one of the ways in which the Spanish Republic is certainly a revolutionary regime. The decision was it will, and women were granted the vote in the Constitution on the same basis as men. But in the course of those discussions in the Cortes, here's these 2 feminists politicians, 2 Republican politicians, and one of them, Clara Campoamor, is arguing that, for example, you see that quotation, I'm a citizen before I'm a woman. And unless I have my rights as a citizen, then everything else is limited. But Victoria Kent is arguing women actually aren't ready for the vote in Spain. Women are dominated by church authority, and if we give them the vote, then it will be a threat to the Republic, and nobody will be better off. So the point of those conversations is that I find them both persuasive to some extent. Of course, in principle, everybody's in favor of Campoamor's line of argument, and she did win the vote in the Cortes. But The significance of it, as I say, from Republican perspective, is that what we see is individuals, feminists in this instance, in both Ireland and Spain, disagreeing with each other, arguing with each other, trying to persuade each other, and men, of course, primarily men. The Cortes was full of men. And that's how it operates, okay? So it's a functioning republic at this time. Obviously more established in Spain, literally the constitution, than it was in Ireland at this point, but nevertheless, the same principle holds. This is republicanism instantiated, republicanism in action. So it's on basis of that, just to conclude, that I really find the parallels between the Irish and Spanish revolutions most persuasive. It's in and through the speeches and through the writings of people like Campoamor, Markievicz, Kent, Sheehy Skeffington, and in and through the poetry and prose writings of people like Antonio Machado and W.B. Yeats. And if I had had time, I would have talked about people like Manuel Azaña and George Russell, who again, you know, evoke archetypal Republican ideas of discussion and contestation. So notwithstanding the vast differences between these conflicts and revolutions, that republicanism as a form of enhanced political living is really comes to the fore in both revolutions. Okay, we'll have to leave it at that, I'm afraid. Thanks very much for attending, and people online.